Welcome, Mr. Timmers. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me first use these microphones. Yeah. And later I may use this to walk around a little. So very pleased to be here. Thank you very much for showing up early in the morning. And I will do my speech in English. And if we have a bit of time, we can also see we are a compact audience for any questions. Happy to answer that. So as you see from the title, I will talk about Europe, about digital, about strategic autonomy, sovereignty. And before I actually really go into that, in this field, we all probably read a lot about digital technologies and about geopolitics and about business and about citizens and these kind of things. And what is always striking me is that when you read these documents, words really matter. So sometimes there are words being used and you think, and perhaps my start of the story here is a bit moralistic, but okay, we are early in the morning, so let's do that. I'm sometimes thinking like, you know, what is actually their mindset? And so you see these kind of words like competitive, global, open markets, innovation, technology neutral, free, private, trade. You can kind of guess what kind of world the world of business is behind that. And then you find also in this field other words like sovereignty, defense, resilience, geopolitics, strategic, state, autonomy, security, and again, you can kind of imagine what kind of mindset is behind that. It's the mindset of those that are defending the states. And then you have these other kind of words that you find in other documents again, which are about rights and values and ethics and democracy and inclusion and sustainability, etc. And it's another kind of world. Now, interesting, of course, these are not quite separate worlds, but still it's interesting to kind of reflect a little bit on it. So there are certain words that are kind of taboo to touch. If you are in the world of business, innovation is sacred. Don't say that innovation should not happen. Innovation always has to be there. If you are in the world of rights and democracy, inclusion is sacred. Everybody is included, isn't it? And if you're in the world of governments, then don't dare to touch the state, because the state is sacred. Well, that's the way things work. But I just want to point out a little bit that there are these kind of word clouds, mindsets, and that also a little bit, you always have to be a bit kind of, how shall I say, aware that if a word is used from one cloud set by the other group, so if business starts to talk about sustainability, at least a few years ago we would say, really? If you have governments that talk about innovation, you always have to wonder, really? Or openness, or global markets, open strategic autonomy, for example. Really? So what do they mean? Okay, this is moralistic. Let's go to more the core of what I say, and therefore also take my words with some grain of salt. Sovereignty. So we talk about sovereignty, and sovereignty is nowadays really a top concern. Sovereignty is so much under pressure that people, my colleague at Oxford talks about a sovereignty gap, Lucas Kello. And why? Well, no kind of secrets or mysteries here for you. The international tensions have been rising. US, China, the war that we have with Russia, very evident that puts the sovereignty of states under pressure. Russia doesn't recognize the sovereignty of Ukraine. Then the digital transformation, or disruption, I should rather say, is really unsettling governments, is really unsettling the state, the sovereignty. Even more so because some of the big tech companies are more powerful than individual governments. And there are these kind of global threats that don't give, so to be a bit impolite, they don't give a damn about sovereignty and the state and etc. They go across. The pandemic doesn't respect borders, climate change doesn't, cybercrime is happening everywhere. And so this puts really sovereignty under pressure. And sovereignty has become a top concern at European level, worldwide. This is what keeps government leaders awake at night. And we talk about sovereignty now, but as a matter of fact, it's not so self-evident. This is only since the last 5 years that really, in a wider sense, in governments, we talk about sovereignty and strategic autonomy. In fact, A few years ago, you couldn't really talk about it, and I will illustrate that later. So where do we actually come from? A bit kind of historic, philosophical. Sovereignty is a very hard to grasp kind of concept. It's not easy to define it. And some philosophers say it's an essentially contested concept. But you might say a marker in point is 1648. It's the Treaties of Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia. Europe at that time was really at war. All these kingdoms, princedoms, dukedoms, or whatever you had, they were fighting each other. And many, many millions of people, they say, actually died. The Holy Empire, the Holy Seat was even involved in that, the Vatican. So then they ultimately signed a treaty in which they recognized the existence of the states, the sovereign states. And that was the beginning, you might say, of the system of sovereign states, and that has evolved over many years into something that is now here in Europe, the European Union. And great philosophers have been involved in that, like also from this country, Baudin, Rousseau, from other countries like Hobbes, that defined what is actually the sovereign, what is the sovereign state, and that actually sovereignty is built up because citizens are recognizing the state. There's a legitimacy between the citizens and the state. The state cannot exist without the citizens cannot exist without the state. That's popular sovereignty. So then you go to the European Union leaping forward, and the European Union is something like member states getting together and putting their sovereignty together. They are having pooled or shared sovereignty. And it seems that they're always giving up something in doing that. They lose a degree of their autonomy in order to give more power to what is called Brussels. It's not necessarily always like that. So I give two examples here that are actually of a different type of sovereignty, namely a win-win sovereignty. No one is giving up anything. The .eu, the domain name that we all use when we want to have a website in Europe. My company is called iv.eu. That is actually something that is owned by all of us Europeans. It's a sovereign asset, a European sovereign asset. It doesn't reduce the sovereignty of any single member state. And as a matter of fact, it enhances the position of Europe in the world. So it's also good for our external legitimacy. And a more, perhaps even more telling example is the COVID-19 pass that we use in order to travel freely with our vaccination certificates throughout Europe. That is something that is in the field of public health, has been agreed upon at European level. Europe doesn't have a mandate to organize health, public health, actually in the member states. So this is where Europe could act, get something together that you can use all throughout Europe, doesn't reduce the sovereignty of any member state. They can still do their public health as they wish to do. And moreover, it's not only European, there's 1 billion people in the world and 62 countries that are also working with the European COVID pass. So it's also enhancing the standing. It's actually a win-win in terms of sovereignty. So that is also possible. Okay. Let's nevertheless try to get a bit better grip on sovereignty and strategic autonomy. What is behind that? So sovereignty is about the things that we feel they belong to us, that we value, and it's about the distribution of power. It's actually saying we will have a government that is in power, but only because we have popular democracy. And it's of course about territory, traditionally. It's about natural resources, whatever is in your ground, in your soil. But it's nowadays also very much about digital resources. So health data as a digital resource belongs to us, and we concern health data, we see health data, we consider that as part of sovereignty. It's also, of course, about people and values and cultures. And there are the two elements that are important in sovereignty is you have to have an internal legitimacy, which is between the state and the citizens. So the state and the citizens have to kind of recognize each other. And you can immediately see how this links to a topic that you have here at this conference, which is digital identity, the citizen identity. That is part of that internal legitimacy. And the external legitimacy is, of course, that a state needs to be also recognized and respected by other states. And as I said, Russia, for example, is not recognizing the sovereignty of Ukraine. All nice talk, but how do you actually make it happen? How you make it happen is called strategic autonomy. It's very practical. Strategic autonomy are the means to make sovereignty a reality. So whatever you think about sovereignty, you will have to do something You'll have to have an army, you'll have to be able to produce, you have to have educated people. So it's about the capabilities, that is what you know. It's about the capacities, that's how much you can do. Factories, how many skilled people, how many good civil servants. And it's about controlling them, having control on that, having a say on it. So you might say strategic autonomy is very practically about capabilities, capacities, and control. Now, I didn't invent this myself. This is actually a definition that comes from the circle of defense, because defense always thinks about capabilities, capacities, and control. But the big difference is now that in the debate about strategic autonomy, it's actually not only about defense, but it's very much about the economy in total, at large. It's very much about society at large. It's about democracy, having the capabilities and capacity and control to have a say on our own democracy, which is, of course, massively undermined nowadays. So we don't have a full strategic autonomy on our democracy. Now, if you want to make, strategic autonomy happening, so you want to have these capabilities, capacities, and control, you can try to do everything yourself, which is called autarky, and that's just a dream. That is not for Europe, so forget about that. No sensible politician will advocate that we have autarky in Europe, certainly not in the digital area. Perhaps some small areas. Some small areas, perhaps we have to keep full control. If you talk about protecting the core of government information, then we need to have crypto for that. Hardware crypto, and hardware crypto should be fully under our own control in Europe. But in many other areas, it's simply not feasible. So what Europe has been doing in the past mostly is an approach which you could call risk management. We try to do our best to have control on our economy and society and democracy, and for the rest we keep our fingers crossed. But keeping the fingers crossed is a bit risky if it is the state itself that we are talking about, potentially undermining the state, the sovereignty gap. So nowadays, it's much more understood that the way you realize strategic autonomy is doing that together with like-minded partners in strategic partnerships. In the case of Europe, for example, obviously the United States or other like-minded partners. In strategic partnerships, you can do a lot more, but you can still not do everything. You may still have dependencies on third countries. And you need to think about those. I will come back to that. What do you do if you have dependencies with non-like-minded countries? And the third way to do it is actually to stand above this whole problem of sovereignty and strategic autonomy and say, well, it's really about something that is a global common good. It's something that we need to manage globally. Take, for example, the domain name system, the management of the internet. That's a global common good, these names, and it's managed by ICANN, a global organization. But there are other examples. Let me give another example. I don't know if people recognize this picture. It's the hole in the ozone layer. And the hole in the ozone layer was kind of discovered in the 70s of the past century. Researchers saw that, and they saw that the ozone layer was eroding, was getting a hole, because of these gases, the CFKs, that come out of the aerosols and out of fridges and so. And we were destroying something that is actually a global common good, which would have affected the sovereignty of every state, each and every state. No one could defend themselves against it except doing it globally. And so a number of enlightened politicians that you still had at that time, and researchers, got together, and they drew up the Montreal Protocol. And that's an agreement to stop producing these CFKs, these gases. That protocol came in force in the 80s, and now, 35 years later, we are actually starting to see that the hole in the ozone layer is reducing. So sovereignty, defending the global common good, can take a long time, but it's feasible. It's a good example, as a matter of fact. So what is the EU doing? European strategic autonomy in the past was mainly dealt with on a risk management basis. We had, for example, the GDPR, data protection. It says explicitly this is about risk management. Even the first cybersecurity law, the NIS directive, which my team wrote and defended and had to agree at European level, was explicitly based on risk management, even if it is about critical infrastructures, like keeping water running, like electricity, like transport. Even there, we said you have to do your best in order to defend yourself against cyber incidents, and then for the rest, keep your fingers crossed. Now, as I say, that's not felt to be not good enough anymore. So we are moving towards strategic partnerships, like the transatlantic. The TTC is the Trade and Technology Council, the cooperation with the United States, amongst others in cybersecurity. The EU Chips Act, about which I will say more. The EU Defence Fund, clearly strategic partnerships with like-minded parties. And we still have a number of things that are kind of in between, like platform regulation, the Direct Markets Act. It's a mix of risk management and a strategic partnership approach. And perhaps the digital wallet, again, I will come back to that, is also a bit in between, still a degree of risk management. And then on the global approach, so can't we deal with a number of things at a global level? Wouldn't that be much smarter? Well, the COVID pass is a good example, but there are other areas of emerging technologies or important technologies, not even anymore emerging, like AI, 5G, 6G, and blockchain, that might perhaps best be dealt with at global level. But they are not yet. A bit peculiar, especially that Europe is not taking more the lead in bringing this to the global level, because this will require international diplomacy. And the best diplomats in the world are actually from Europe. So can't we do more to raise these problems to the global level? Well, okay, let's then do a reality check. How good can we be in strategic autonomy, and especially in strategic autonomy when we talk about digital? Well, one thing is that in strategic autonomy, the word strategic autonomy is nowadays used for everything. You've got digital strategic autonomy, technology strategic autonomy, defense strategic autonomy, material strategic autonomy, health strategic autonomy, and especially in this country, they like to attach the word strategic autonomy to anything. So it's a little bit like if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So not everything is strategic autonomy. Secondly, a lot of hope is put on the European Union to design policy, strategy, investment, and what have you, to safeguard our European strategic autonomy. But you have to be aware that Europe has a very limited mandate. If you are working in the European institutions, you can only, for example, propose a law if you can base it on the treaties. And so you start looking up the treaties and you don't find the word sovereignty. Twice, in fact, for 2 military bases that the UK has in Cyprus. So twice irrelevant. That's all that is said explicitly about sovereignty. So if you say, let's make a law for digital identity, for sovereign digital identity, good luck. You can't find it immediately in the treaty where you should link that to. You have to find something else, like it's good for the internal market, and then you can do a good job. And there are also some of these kind of fallacies, you know, these kind of dreams or wrong reasonings around strategic autonomy. One of that is that strategic autonomy would be about protectionism. It's not about protectionism. When people say protectionism, think back to the word cloud. Where are they coming from? And why are they using the word protectionism? It's not about protectionism. It's not realistic. Some others are saying, well, let's take back control. Let's build strategic autonomy by taking back control. Let's take back control on the cloud. But Europe never had control on the cloud. That's looking backward. That's like Brexit, looking backward to something that you never had. And you know where Brexit went. So you have to look forward. You have to look at what is the future of the cloud. What is edge cloud, for example? Not look back towards something that we never had. And digital itself really puts sovereignty and strategic autonomy to the test. So let's do a bit of a reality check also when digital enters into the world of governments and states and sovereignty and strategic autonomy. One of that is we have a dependency dilemma. This is a complicated graph. It's not intended to be read in detail, but what it says is the dependency that countries have in the digital world on the United States. So the United States has no dependency, of course. It's only dependent on itself. But then how this has changed over the past years. And all of these countries in the top have become more dependent, and this is all of the European countries, have become more dependent on the United States than less dependent despite what we want to do in strategic autonomy. Because, for example, 65% of all of the cloud in Europe is provided by the 3 large American cloud providers. That's the dependency, and that has grown over the past year instead of having become less. The only one at the very bottom that has significantly reduced its dependency is China. Because China explicitly wants to become independent from the United States. So we have to look at China when you think about strategic autonomy. Then there is another dilemma, that's the technological dilemma. Governments, states, citizens, public services, commercial services, democracy are all digital nowadays. We are very dependent upon a range of digital technologies, but there are so many of them. Quantum, nanotechnology, materials technologies, semiconductors, networks, computing, data, cloud, social media, AI. So if we work on strategic autonomy, it's easily said, let's do strategic autonomy, but you have a problem of choice. What is it that you are going to do first? Are you going to do first digital identity, semiconductors, cloud, quantum for the future? Tell me. And there is no plan yet in Europe to say what is our strategic priority setting in the choice of technologies. And the final one that I want to just mention here, digital also really is interesting and posing a dilemma for democracy. So what you see here is a smart application. It's an AI program that is watching parliamentarians sitting in the Belgian parliament. And it's watching whether these parliamentarians are actually looking at their mobile phone while they are in the political debate. And you see that important parliamentarians are spending 2/3 or half of their time on the mobile phone. So they are exposed by the help of digital, but you have to be careful. Because perhaps actually these parliamentarians have to run a job in the parliament and also take care of their kids at home. Perhaps it's just like that. Or perhaps they are looking up additional information. So digital can be also help to create transparency, but can also create misinformation. And we know everything about misinformation, isn't it? So let me go to 2 concrete initiatives at European level. One is the EU Chips Act. So the chips, the semiconductors that are in all our electronic systems, there's a comprehensive strategic autonomy initiative that has been proposed by Thierry Breton in February of this year. And it's comprehensive because it actually has 3 very important relevant pillars. One pillar is about building up our capabilities, our knowledge, research and development. The second pillar is about building up our capacities, which is the big factories, as they call it, the fabs, that are producing the chips. And there's a lot of money made available for that. And the third is about monitoring and the supply of chips. Namely, you know, we have a chip supply crisis. Not enough chips were supplied. Automotive, for example, the car factories had to stop production because the chips were there. We want to prevent that such a crisis happens again. So it's very comprehensive. But in fact, it's also quite challenging. And it's especially challenging in view of geopolitics internationally. Because Europe is not the only one that has a chips plan. The US has a chips plan, and it's somewhat bigger. And then Taiwan has a huge chip plan. Japan has a very big chips plan. Not to mention China, which has a very, very, very big chips plan. So is our chips plan good enough internationally? There's some kind of subsidy race going on. And even if we try to become more independent together with the United States, because this is really a strategic partnership initiative, the largest investor in semiconductors in Europe is going to be Intel, an American company. So they are really part of the plan. We still will have foreign dependencies, materials, for example, coming from China. And we have to know what do we do with these dependencies. And there are also changing conditions that are due to geopolitics that we have to take into account. For example, energy has become so much more expensive in Europe. And in the future fabs, the ones that are going to 3 and 2 nanometer sizes, 50% of the total cost is going to be energy. And Europe has a real disadvantage in that. So this is geopolitics that comes immediately into these kind of plans. Let me mention, as a final one, a second initiative, the EU Digital Identity and Digital Wallet. So is that also a strategic autonomy initiative? is it also really about our sovereignty? Well, to a degree, I would say. I think we are all aware that citizen identity is really a sovereign asset. Citizen identity is not created by companies. It's created by governments and citizens in a democratic relationship. It legitimizes citizens, it legitimizes government. So citizen identity is a sovereign asset. It's really one of those kind of things that you have to do to consider part of your sovereignty. And the EU digital wallet legislation, the proposal, the eIDAS 2 legislation, I had the pleasure with my team to do eIDAS 1. I'm happy to see eIDAS 2, the EU digital wallet initiative. It's a positive step because it recognizes that this is really an asset that belongs to all of us and that we have to have sufficient control on that asset. But at the same time, it's not complete. You know, we don't have a real, full functioning digital identity ecosystem in Europe. And much of the digital identity world is going to be provided by, well, you can fill in the question mark, by all kind of providers. And if this is about sovereignty, and it is about sovereignty, we will have to impose some requirements on these providers. We'll have to insist that the infrastructure for digital identity is resilient. It always has to function. And it respects sovereignty. It's not undermining the government, also not indirectly. It has to be sovereign by design. And because data from citizens can now be combined with, for example, commercial or other data, we need to have democratic oversight in order to avoid that we get into something that is surveillance capitalism. Or we need to make sure that there is an unbundling, as is happening to an extent in the Digital Markets Act, between the provision of digital identity related to citizen identity and other kind of identity-related data that have to do, for example, with your commercial activities. And we have to be proactive as Europe on foreign direct investment. Very smart technology is developed here, including in companies here, and we should be careful that that technology is not just going to go somewhere else by foreign takeovers. If it happens, it may be a good thing, but not just because this concerns sovereignty. So all of this for a viable and sovereign EU digital identity ecosystem. Final slide. So EU sovereignty is here to stay, and that's quite remarkable. So I said I would come back to that. European sovereignty, 5 years ago, there was a speech by Jean-Claude Juncker, who was at that time the president of the European Commission, and he gave his State of the Union speech, and the State of the European Union speech was, the title of that was, "The hour of European sovereignty has come." Half of Europe fell over him. Half of Europe said, "You don't talk about European sovereignty. It's a taboo word." Nowadays, only 6 weeks ago, Bundeskanzler Scholz gave a speech in Prague where he used the word European sovereignty multiple times, and it was one of the 3 main elements of his speech, European sovereignty. So the world changes. It's here to stay. I would say for the next 10 years, count on it that European sovereignty will continue to be a theme for your business too. And what do we need to do? We need to invest, we need to collaborate, we need to regulate, we need to monitor, we need to educate. Because this is a comprehensive strategic autonomy initiative that we need to have in these areas. We need to invest in our capabilities, in our capacities, in our control, and it will cost money. We need to collaborate with like-minded partners internationally, but also collaborate private-public. We need to regulate what is happening in our markets and insist when we buy, as governments, that we buy something that is sovereign by design, that doesn't take sovereignty for granted, or perhaps even undermines it. We have to monitor what is happening. So there will still be external dependencies. And I think look at what the Chinese are doing. So the Chinese did in 2018 an analysis of their foreign dependencies in technologies, 34 of them, and for each of them, what they call the choke points, for each of them, they thought about it, what are we going to do? Diversify suppliers. So that's dependency on foreign providers. Diversify suppliers. Build up our own capacity. Buy foreign companies. Develop intellectual property. Copy or whatever you can think of it. We need to have a strategy in Europe for all of our critical dependencies. And then finally, I would say educate. And educate is, of course, the civil servants, because it's very hard. It's, of course, business, because it's very hard to think about strategic autonomy. But I would say especially educate when we talk about young people. because sovereignty is about what is valuable, but you need to know what is valuable in order to value it, also when you are young. And perhaps we have lost that a little bit in the last 20, 30 years. I would say education, how sensitive it is, because education can be captured by populists and nationalists, but still we need to educate about sovereignty. So with that, thank you very much.